Thank you for joining us today for our International Community IC short episode, focusing on the latest breaking story and what the ICIJ claims to be the largest investigation in journalism history, exposing a shadow financial system that benefits the world's most rich and powerful, the Pandora Papers. The report was released on Sunday, October 3rd by the International Consortium Investigative Journalists, which involves 600 journalists from 150 media outlets in 117 countries. The findings shed light on the previously hidden dealings of the elite and the corrupt, and how they have used offshore accounts to shield assets collectively worth trillions of dollars. And so here with me today to discuss these findings is Helen Darbishire, Director of Access Info Europe. Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Elle. It's a great pleasure to be with you joining you from Madrid.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful city too.
Indeed.
So Helen, I wanted to see, after the release of the report on Sunday, you did a reflection on what the Pandora Papers tell us about the anti-corruption and integrity instruments in Europe. Can you give us an idea of or a briefing of your findings?
Yes. First of all, as you said, it's an absolutely impressive piece of work by these over 600 journalists around the world, and a huge volume of information that's been leaked. Right. The sad thing about this is that we have to rely on leaks to get this information, which reveals a combination of corruption, with money being taken out of often not particularly rich countries by a corrupt elite and being laundered through offshores and ending up often in more developed countries, in property in London or the French Riviera, for example. And even when it's not actual illegal activity or corruption per se, when wealthy individuals are using shell companies, for instance, to avoid avoid or evade paying taxes. This is a problem. This is a problem that I think is particularly concerning in the world right now, given that the economic impact of the global coronavirus pandemic and how we're having to invest and borrow and invest a lot of money for our economies to get out of the pandemic. What's really sad, I think, is that we know what is needed to prevent this. We know the kinds of anti-corruption instruments that we need to put in place, the transparency mechanisms that are needed in order to stop this happening. And that's been the analysis that Access Info has been doing this week. When we see the kind of things that are being exposed, and we can analyze and say, well, if we had fully open company registers in Europe, for a start, then we'd be able to see much more clearly what's going on, because you'd be able to, using investigative journalism, data journalism techniques, but you'd be able to take the company registers from a number of countries and track the way that through complex company structures, jumping from countries in Europe, from Luxembourg, from the Netherlands, across to Panama, across to the Seychelles, wherever, Bahamas, you'd be able to see how these companies are being used to avoid paying tax. That would be an amazing first step. And I can tell you a little bit more about the situation in Europe and how we're making progress with that, but I can say that we're not yet there. And therefore, we learn about these kinds of scandals only when the information is leaked.
Right. I know you just mentioned, we know what we need and the transparency elements, and then you mentioned the company registers. Is that the only thing that you think right now, or is that brings about the transparency, or other things that maybe as journalists can look into that could be more of those transparency elements?
It's not the only thing, Elle, but right now we're strategically prioritizing that, because that is really the number one thing that we need. And because we're very close to getting it. So in Europe, a number of countries have opened up their company registers. Ukraine, the UK, there are a few that have made progress, often under open government partnership action plans. In the European area, the European Union in 2019 passed a directive, which is something that's binding on all 27 EU member states, which is called the Open Data Directive. And in that, it says that company registers will be open. Now, that should have gone into force in July 2021, 2 years after it was adopted, but it hasn't. And the reason is there's been some pushback from member states, from lobbyists, and we understand it's precisely the kind of people whose names are cropping up in the Pandora Papers who are probably pushing and trying to resist the full adoption and entry into force of these transparency rules. So when we see that, it's clearly it's time to act. We're very, very close. These are measures that should be coming into place right now, and they're not there yet. And the Pandora Papers, for me, is just another argument. And it's not another sort of drop of water. It's a huge.
Right.
It really shows us how important this is and how urgent this is. So open company registers is one measure. Mm-hmm. There are other measures. We definitely need greater transparency. This is something I'm also the chair of the UNCAT coalition, the Global Anti-Corruption Coalition of civil society organizations working to fight corruption. Right. And another thing that we're looking at right now is transparency around the identification of stolen assets, the freezing of those assets and the return of those assets, because it's often the case that prosecutors, anti-fraud investigators are on the trail of these things which the journalists have exposed. But if we were to have the information, if we were to have greater transparency of that work, if we could know, for example, in any particular country when assets are frozen, then that would allow the anti-corruption organizations, the investigative journalists to do their complementary digging and perhaps bring forward the evidence that is needed to really take these cases to court, to recover the assets and to return them to the people to whom they belong, from whom they were stolen. So there are other complementary mechanisms, yes.
Right. And this isn't the first time we're seeing stories like this popping up. So why do you think this time it's different? Is it different?
Well, I think that what's positive about these big leaks, these big scandals, is that they do help us move forward. So thanks to LuxLeaks and to the Panama Papers, we did get the European Union, for example, if I'm looking at the European space, to commit to opening up the beneficial owners of companies. That's not enough, but it's an important step in the right direction. And that's something that has been achieved, and those beneficial ownership registers are going into place. And if you look at this year's, also very positive, and I'm sure that the scandals and the big leaks helped to make this happen. In June of this year, the UN had a special General Assembly session on the fight against corruption. And there's a political declaration that comes out of that, which is only a declaration, it's not hard law, but nevertheless, it recognizes the need for greater transparency. It highlights a number of transparency mechanisms that we need at the national level, things like assets declarations, conflicts of interest declarations, protecting whistleblowers, as well as beneficial ownership data being made public. So it's not particularly complex. There are a number of measures which, if they were all put in place in every country, we would have a significant impact on the fight against corruption. Right. Now, there are measures which will cost a certain amount to collect the data, make it all, digitalize it all, and open it. But the amount you save, the amount that the taxpayer saves in terms of preventing corruption on the one hand, right, and ensuring that taxes are collected and go to where they should, which is into the public purse, so they can be spent on health, on education, on public services. Right. Immediately, the cost of any investment in getting these registers and these instruments set up and implemented is minimal compared with what we could possibly save. And if you look at the amount of money that we're talking about with the Pandora Papers, then clearly there is a lot of value in stopping this kind of thing happening again in the future.
Right. And so within our community, we have a lot of journalists that are in the beginning of their career. And so what tips would you give them, or do you have any idea about, after these papers or this report has come out, what are some tips that you would have of what to focus on, or maybe no light has been shed on yet, whether you want to focus on Europe or if we have a more global perspective? We'd love to hear what you think about.
Yeah,
stuff.
I think that there's a lot that journalists are doing, but there's a lot that journalists, you don't have to be the sort of core investigative journalist at the heart of the ICIJ, although I'm sure lots of people right now are dreaming of getting there.
Right.
First of all, look at the information that is available in many countries, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa increasingly. Things like public procurement. We've made huge progress in opening up public procurement. It may not be perfect, but you can take your public procurement database. If you're lucky, it's available as open data. If not, you're going to have to do a bit of scraping. So learn the techniques, learn how to manage Excel, learn how to scrape data off a government website and how to manipulate it, use it. But look for patterns. We know the kinds of red flags you should be looking for. Public procurement with single bidders, below the threshold, a lot of procurement which is just below the threshold for transparency rules, that kind of thing, or for tighter control. So start by looking at the data that is made available proactively to the extent that it is. Don't only think about your own country, think about looking elsewhere. Think, well, you know, there's businessmen in my country who are doing business in the UK or in Denmark or in Chile, I don't know, and then think about what data you can get in those countries.
Right.
From the open company registers or open procurement data or whatever it may be. So think a little bit outside your own particular bubble, and learn how to use your right of access to information to ask for information which isn't already in the public domain. And that's, I think, something that a lot of journalists are a little bit, I don't want to use the word lazy, but a little bit resistant to doing, because you look at the time frames and it's like, oh, 15 working days, 20 working days, and then there might be an extension. Oh, but I need to write a story tomorrow. But if you send your request now, in 4 weeks' time or 6 weeks' time, then you may get the information and you may have a story. And if you get a refusal, that's a different kind of story. Why aren't they giving me the information? So we have a right of access to information. The laws that we have in 135 countries around the world are varying in strength, but nevertheless, you have laws that you can use. And as I say, even a refusal or a failure to answer is potentially a story. So learn how to use your right of access to information. And once again, don't be limited to your own country, because although there are some countries which require you to be a citizen or to have an ID from that country, the majority of countries allow requests from all around the world. So from the Access Info office in Madrid, we're regularly sending, I can send a request to Mexico or to Slovenia or to Sweden, and I've done it. I've absolutely done it. And we do it all the time, trying to collect comparative information from different countries. So use your right of access to information. If you're not sure where to begin, then me and my colleagues at Access Info, we have guides for journalists and we have tips and we are ready to help. We work with different journalistic organizations doing training for journalists as well. So get in touch with us and we're always happy to help point you in the right direction so you can use your right of access to information. And I would remind everyone that this is a right, as in human right, and that's been confirmed by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Committee, and so forth. So for journalists of all kinds, the cutting edge investigative journalists and young reporters just starting out, you do have a right to get information from government. And it's something that you should really insist on, exercise that right and get information which helps us make the world a fairer, more just place.
Wonderful, wonderful. And for those that want to learn more about where to go, can you give us more information about Access Now and where they can go to get these resources?
Access Info Europe, and our website, because there's a few organizations with access in the name, so
Right.
we have to be clear about it. Our website is access-info.org, and we do have some resources for journalists, including our Legal Leaks Handbook, how to get information without relying on the leaks. The leaks are important, but there are other ways to get information. And so we have lots of tips there about how to get started.
And from your experience, what do you see happening in Europe in the coming weeks, or what would you like to see happening after the reports come out?
I think the Pandora Papers, I mean, there's a lot of reaction. A lot of people are talking about it. And for those of us who are pushing for greater transparency, undoubtedly, this work does help us move our campaigns forward. And we do that so that in turn, the information is available for journalists who need it. So it's definitely something.
Wonderful.
Sorry, that's my phone going, sorry.
No worries. And we're towards the end of the conversation. I just wanted to make sure, is there anything you wanted to add that we may not have discussed that you think is important to go over in regards to the Pandora Papers, your organization, or as a whole, what to think about going forward?
No, I think your questions have been very comprehensive, and I think that we've covered everything. I think that, again, even though for those journalists who haven't worked on the Pandora Papers, when we get big leaks like this, maybe not every story has been spotted. So I'm always encouraging people, if you just to surf the data that's available, be it data that's released. Governments these days are releasing a huge amount of data proactively on their websites. So look at it, look at what data sets you can combine to data sets to get something that's interesting. And maybe you can look at your public procurement database that's in the public domain with some information that's coming out of the Pandora Papers. And maybe you'll find a story that nobody else has spotted before. Think about the local level as well, because often we go for the big high level figures, but there may be some names that nobody recognizes, but you at your local level, you go, oh, that guy is a real problem around here. I've got to look into that a bit more, or that girl, but so
definitely talk in our community about a lot of going from local, like finding local stories from global matters. And
absolutely. It's true that sometimes, especially when there's corruption, local government tends to be a bit more resistant about transparency. And that's where you may need to insist a bit. And as I say, this is a right, and many countries now have some kind of information commissioner or some kind of body that you can turn to actually get support in defending your right to access information. So if you're a journalist working at the local level and you're not so familiar with that, a good tip is to talk to those maybe who do have an idea. Again, a lot of the information will be available online. Contact your local or national transparency organization, or get in touch with us at Access Info, and we're happy to help you with guidance on how you can actually use your right of access to information, use the data that's available already proactively published, and use that to make stories.
beautiful. Thank you so much, Helen, for making the time to speak with us today. And we'll be sure to share this information with our community. For those that have had the chance to view the session with us today, please make sure to join the international community's website, and we have a Facebook group where you can join and where we continue our conversations. And I hope that we get the chance to speak again.
Wonderful.
I'm sure there's going to be more topics that come up, and I look forward to connecting with you again, Helen. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Elle. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.